Salute, 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 salute. Um, I wanted to more or less kind of discuss some history in which I think history is best qualified. And oftentimes we have to examine and re examine history in order to show and prove the effort and the qualitative uh, production that we were able to, or that you're able to create. Um, I met Erick Khafre in 2001. I met him in 2001. Uh, we were classmates in high school together. We went to David W. Carter High School. It's in Oak Cliff. Um, the school is actually mentioned in a couple of movies, several movies related to football, one of which is on Netflix, called Carter High. And so we went to Carter together. And that's how we were able to more or less communicate and come in contact with each other. We had a six-period class together with Miss Brown. Miss Brown was our six-period class teacher, which she taught computer literacy, uh, which everybody needs. I recommend that everyone work towards becoming, if you're not becoming, computer literate. And so that's what we were striving to become within that the confines of that class, was to become computer literate. And so that was the basis. And so it was a six-period class, which means that the beginning of the day was in the fifth period. The second class of the day would have been the sixth period. And so we would uh, meet each other or see each other in the six-period class. I, of course, at that particular time was not as a great student in terms of that class as Erick was. I think Erick may have finished his assignments on time or slightly before time, whereas I had somewhat of trouble completing my assignment, at least as far as the computer literacy aspect of it. He was able to complete his on time. I struggled with it. I struggled with it. Um, I struggled with it. In this story time, I'll kind of discuss how we came into interaction with each other, how we met each other, and how ultimately we have been able to create a number of different groups locally, nationally, and influence some people nationally, and perhaps some would say even internationally. Uh, but through computer literacy is when we bumped into each other. We didn't create the schedule. The schedule was naturally created. I'm not so sure if I had not bumped into him, would I have been a part of something or some things that I would have later interacted with. I think it was he was a great contribution towards my development as far as my politics, as far as my thinking and processes and outlook. And oftentimes we would tag along, if you will, and experience things together, learning new terminology, new experiences, greeting, meeting new people. Um, and that's kind of sort of how we got to this point. Um, so from computer class, which was at sixth period, again, I struggled. He, of course, was a good student. We began to talk. Um, my father was a number one supporter and at one time a member of the Nation of Islam back in the latter end of the 60s and early 70s. And some of my extended family, other family members as well, were a part of that um, ideological, spiritual thinking or school of thought, as some would say. And I had kind of been pre-exposed to some degree um, concerns and attraction, if you will, to black nationalist type of formations. And so I consider Nation of Islam to come from that very, from that line of thinking. And so I had been a part of that. And so for me personally, I think this was during the time where my uncle Kenneth, also known as Hassan Shamsuddin, had passed away, and I had actually moved in briefly with my uncle Asadi. Um, and because I interacted at that time with my uncle and just kind of the experience with Uncle Kenneth or Hassan Shamsuddin passing away, all of that played a significant role into my overall development. Prior to that, the summer before, I had really did some studies as a sophomore, junior in the Iona Prize lecture series, which has a um, pretty good talk or discussion about Chairman Fred Hampton, the Chicago chapter of the Black Panther Party. Uh, Talks about that whole experience, the organizing in Chicago in '68, and again the latter part of '69, and ultimately culminated with Chairman Fred Hampton Sr. Being assassinated, being murdered by the Chicago Police Department, Mayor Daley, and also with complete uh, control and ideas by J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI targeted the Black Panther Party. Well, anyway, for me, that background of being experienced with my father, mother, uncle, etc., kind of coming into the Iona Prize, learning about Chairman Fred, going in detail with Chairman Fred, and then later on running into Dr. Yosef Binyakinen, who is a anthropological or who was an anthropological teacher, historian, um, and great historian as far as explaining the history of Black people, otherwise known as African people around the world, and particularly in the heart of Africa on the East continent, in the East African section. Dr. Yosef Binyakinen and some of his students, such as Ashwa Kwesi, played a significant role in my understanding at that time. And so all of this is kind of going on at the same time prior to meeting Erick Khafre and then meeting and then learning in more detail together at the same time along with them. I remember we would exchange books, pass books, things of this nature. And often we'll get into these discussions. He, of course, likened himself to Malcolm X. He liked Malcolm X, as many of us do. I think Malcolm X is oftentimes the staple of what folks recognize as Black manhood or Black leadership, or what a man should be for his community as well as his family. I think Malcolm oftentimes is a standard bearer. Um, and for me, um, and for me, these conversations created a situation where it led to us sort of to seek external conversation. But initially, we were inside of David Carter. This is my 12th grade year, his 11th grade year. So he had an extra year to go for him, but I was on my way out. And we would meet with some um, other students within the school, and they were very much so leaning towards obviously the ideas of Christianity, and they would have Bibles and they would have biblical discussions. And so these sort of meetings occurred early on in the morning. So let's just say school started, let's say 8 o'clock. These meetings would commence with the students early on at about 7:15 or so. There was a teacher who would get to school early, and he would open his class and allow the space, which ultimately was about 5 to 10 of us would meet at any given time and really just kind of have discussion. Of course, there was uh, a couple of people who were more of on the administrative side who was sort of kind of direct the meeting, but these were not staff; these were only students who would do that, and that was our thing. And oftentimes the teacher would not necessarily be in the room, but we would have these discussions. And so me and Erick would go to these meetings with the understanding of concepts from what we read from Malcolm X. We would go to these meetings with the understanding of things we read from Dr. Ben Yakinen, from watching Ashwa Kwesi. And keep in mind, I'm talking about the early 2000s. I'm talking about 2001, 2002. All of this information that we have readily accessible to us now through Google was not accessible at that particular time. It was not anything that you can get your fingers on at that time. You had to really know somebody, know someone who could share that information with you, who would be willing to trust you to share that information with you, and you had to be able to read, write, and be able to disseminate the information, not just do research on Google. And so, though in those days, it was a little more difficult to access the information. Now the information is essentially everywhere, and we got total information highway that that's going on, back and forth communication online around the world. But then there was not hardly any, and so the information that we would get, we know was very sacred to us. Uh, the Dr. Ben books, the Ashwa Kwesi tapes. I think at that time, I know Ashwa Kwesi tapes at that time was $40. If you, yeah, and if you remember, in the late '80s, early '90s in Dallas, that they used to host an event called the Third Eye Conference, and these types of lecturers would come to Dallas. Ashwa Kwesi or any other speaker on the lecture tour would come to Dallas and would readily speak and share information. This was just information that you really couldn't get just anywhere. You had to know, had to be in the know. And so we felt at that particular time, although we didn't have all the information, we had enough information to hold a conversation and at least propose these sort of ideas in context with some of the biblical discussions that were had at that particular time within the early morning meetings at the school. And so from this, I used to walk with a Bible. I used to keep a Bible in my backpack. I used to keep a Quran in my backpack because during those days, I was attending the Nation of Islam meetings as a high school student. I would attend their meetings, ride the bus sometimes, and there was a brother by the name of Cornelius X, who I believe who later became a minister, and also James 3X, who later moved to Cleveland, who I initially bumped into, and they sort of kind of pointed me in direction on where the nation was. And so these discussions I would have with Erick, and Erick would have discussions with me. He talked to me about a time when he was a child, when he had a school project, and he wrote something to the effect that, you know, the black man, from his perspective, was more infinite, and you know that white people at that time wasn't very thoughtful of black people, um, and so he had to deal with that because he wrote it. He dealt with that as a child, and having conversations with his teacher. And I'm sort of obviously paraphrasing his experience, but having to having the mother like he had, who was very supportive of his thinking 100%, and just being from rural Arkansas, which everybody know Arkansas is Black Belt South. Being from rural Arkansas, his mother was very receptive of this sort of kind of thinking, this sort of black nationalist, self-determination, Malcolm X oriented type of thinking. She was very supportive of it. And so at these school events, sometimes we would get into these not physical, but obviously sort of heated discussions on black people's role in the world. I mean, and these was as high school students. This was in the context of of the of the class. I remember one particular time, this the teacher, who was a white man, had shared with me the book Niggas to Guys. And he told me, and I'm not sure about it, he told me that someone had left the book, and he shared it to me. He gave it to me and said someone had left it. I think Niggas to Guys was written by Wakil, I believe. But when I think about it, he may have deliberately shared that book with us, with me, with Erick, because he probably felt that we were at the point where we could at least have some small bit of understanding about what the book was in discussion about and what what details were shared. When thinking about it some years back, I often thought that he may have accidentally gave me the book or gave us the book because he thought we misplaced it. But now in hindsight, he may have wanted to give us the book, but he did so indirectly so that it couldn't be stated that he gave us this sort of book. And if you know uh, anything about a book, Niggas to Guys, it talks about history, talks about black men and black family interactions. It talks about the importance of the role of men and women in the creation and the protection of the children. That sort of kind of thing is what's really discussed. And obviously some more details that I won't relay here within the book. But this is what's was discussed, and this man shared it with me, and so now I'm thinking he probably gave us the book on purpose, but did so indirectly. And much later, uh, I ultimately, of course, graduated from high school, and I was off. I didn't particularly come back anymore per se, and I'm sure Erick continued the rest of his school year and went forward the next fall at David Carter High School as normal. But what later happened was I was driving down Wheatland Road one Sunday evening on Wheatland, and I noticed him walking. Now, to know Erick, if you know him, you know he has his own special type of walk, and he walks a certain kind of way. And so I noticed the walk. Then I noticed him. At that particular time, he had a long beard, and that was one of his trademark uh, things was he had a long extended beard, probably the longest beard in all of the high school, probably in all of Dallas Independent School District, including the teachers. He had a long beard. And so I seen him, and I was driving down the street. I passed him. I ended up U-turning back, picked him up, and basically took him home, which is a short drive, maybe a couple of minutes from where I picked him up at. But from that point on, we sort of rekindled our relationship, if you will, at that time. And some of the things that eventually became was because of we interacted or ran across each other again the second time. But prior to seeing him, I was thinking to myself, I hated that I never did get his telephone number. And so if you are like me, sometimes you interact with people, you got good communication, and especially in those days, there wasn't any social media or anything of that nature. I don't think Facebook came out in 2004. There wasn't any MySpace or anything like that. And so if you interacted with somebody in those days, if you didn't get their telephone number, well, you wasn't because you wasn't gonna get in touch with them no more, unless you knew somebody that knew them. But I didn't know anybody that kind of shared that relationship with Erick. It was just me that I knew of that had the relationship. Didn't have any mutual friends or anything. And some of the kids that we went to school with in the environment where we'd have those religious discussions with some of the church oriented members. Of course, I didn't keep in contact with them, and they didn't keep in contact with me. But we would more or less continue our relationship from that point, and that's more or less how I officially met his mom for the first time, and I saw how supportive that she was to her son. And I tell you, and I say with great confidence, that it's not too many times often that you meet a mother who is more supportive of her son, and who, regardless of uh, what he's into, especially if he's doing the right thing, she's going to remain supportive in his corner. And I just remember that part of it, and what eventually came later, which me and Erick, we started to travel to these churches, and I say it this way: at that particular time, his home church was called Love and Fellowship. I believe it was in Duncanville. I was invited to go one particular time, in which I did attend. I went to Love and Fellowship with him, sat in there, and kind of interacted. And I kind of liked the vibe of the church, his particular church, because they obviously knew him. It was a smaller church, but it wasn't too small, but it was small enough for the pastor to know him, and but it was big enough for Erick's extended family, for example, his grandfather and his grandfather's wife or grandmother, if you will. Some extended family members would attend that church. Even his mother attends that church, and that's when I got a little bit more personal with him. Now, from that point, we thought, let's try to. We was trying to figure out what is our role in all of this, because we was having discussions about, keep in mind, about from Carter High School, about uh, black people's role in the world, and we was speaking about it more or less from a theoretical perspective, or based upon what we read or watched on a documentary setting. And we was trying to figure out at that time, well, how could we interact with that and make that into reality as something that we could reciprocate? And so, because he was at that time still supporting his community church at that time. Now, I won't dare say that like he was a Christian or anything, but I would say that we did go a couple times to his church, and we felt that the church was probably the strongest organization that we've had in the black community, I think, here in the Americas, as far as the level of organization, as far as the level of financial consistency and growth and things of this nature, and just being a backbone. The church has been something that has been very strong, whether you agree or disagree, especially here in the Black Belt South, or church-oriented South, which we are in, and um, so we started the church, and we started at his church, and then we ventured to other churches to try to kind of figure out what could we do and how could we interact with people who may have had more resources than us. And we thought this was extremely important, because growing up as a child, I would often hear how the church wasn't necessarily supportive of a lot of things, and to some degree, I've always agreed with that sentiment. However, I would say at the same time that some of the greatest organizers that we've had come from the church, and that's I'm looking at it from now a more mature perspective than I may have looked at that time in 2001, 2000, etc. Um, and with that being stated, we went to several churches. I remember at one particular time at a church on Wheatland Road we went to, and some kind of way we sat down with the deacons, the pastors, the entire church administration. We sat down with. They sat down with us, or maybe they invited us to one of their meetings to sit and talk with them. And one of the first questions they asked us, they said, "Are you a Christian?" And I remember Erick telling them blatantly no. He said, "I'm not a Christian." And the funny thing about that is that's how that conversation more or less ended. It didn't really end like that quickly, but you can tell that the energy in the room sort of changed when Erick said, no, he's not a Christian. And he was blatant about that. And we oftentimes, when we get together and somehow we bring that situation up, we laugh about that. We laugh about that even to this day, because I of course said yes. He very quickly said no. He very quickly said no, uh, that he wasn't. And so we learned real quick that if we're going to be going to these churches, and trying to, get resources, get support, or figure out our part in the process. That's really what we was trying to do, figure out our part in the process. Then um, we had to get with the program. We had to get with the program. And so a little later, after we sort of got fed up with kind of going to the churches, we created something, and he was very much so a part of this process, called Community Unification Day, which we did at a local park. We did it at a local park, Community Unification Day. And with that Unification Day, our objective was to try to get the community to more or less come to us. And so we did like this barbecue that we were doing, and we got some people to participate. It was just really a learning experience, and that's really what we ultimately was looking for. We was ultimately looking for a learning experience. That's the biggest thing I want to express to all revolutionaries, potential revolutionaries, organizers, whatever it is you identify yourself is, to go out and sort of challenge, if you will, your perspectives, your beliefs, and have it interact with what's currently going on to see if it's something that's absolutely acceptable, absolutely agreeable, absolutely something that can fulfill yourself, your desires, but also be able to take care of the community with that. And so we use that as an example as to what we would later create. But essentially, this is how I initially met Erick, Carter High School, computer class, Ms. Brown computer class, later running into him on Wheatland Road, meeting his family, going to a number of different churches in the community at the time. One, of course, was IBOC we went to as well, and trying to figure out our role in the process, and ultimately deciding upon that, hey, we have to be able to do this ourselves. And you talking about 19 to 20-year-olds just saying, hey, we're going to organize something called Community Unification Day. And then much later, a little later, run across a brother at Pan-African Connection by the name of Bendeli Tayemba, who's the owner of the bookstore at that particular time. And early on as a kid, my family, my mother particularly, especially, would buy books from Pan-African Connection, and so I kind of remember interacting with that, but I didn't necessarily remember exactly where it's at. So, because when you're a child and you go places and you're going with your mother or father, it's a lot different than when you become an adult, because now you can remember streets and turn right, turn left. But as a kid, you're just riding. So it was an interesting thing to interact with Mandela and Pan-African Connection at that time. But that's how we more or less got to our point where we become, I guess, if you will, organizers. That's how we got to our point. It was, I'm giving a brief explanation, but that's more or less kind of how we interacted together. And we went through this process together for the most part, of figuring out who, what, when, where, and how, and figuring out exactly how we should do it. And we had a number of different influences. And I think that one of our greatest influences, I think, well, at least for me, was Dead Prez, the rap group Dead Prez, M1, the Stick Man, whom we later brought to Dallas to Pan-African Connection in 2009. The Pan-African Connection that was on Jefferson Road, not in South Dallas, but on Jefferson Road. And so all of this is very significant, and some things I hadn't really just thought about. But I will tell you that our first protest, which is documented, was in 2003 at Home Depot. And there was a gentleman who worked at Home Depot. And at that particular time, I thought $15 an hour, and it might have been $15 an hour was a good job. I guess that's about $30,000 a year or something. But he was making $15 an hour, and they were shortening the hours. And so what he did at the time, this man who worked at Home Depot, he decided that he was going to protest. And me and Eric, we was riding in my car one day, which was an 85 Honda Accord, burgundy, um, stick shift. We was riding in my Honda Accord, and we saw this man with a sign, and we immediately pulled up, parked at the Home Depot parking lot, got out, asked him why he was demonstrating, why he was protesting, and he told us, his version of events or why he was protesting, something to the effect that he felt that the employees within Home Depot were very upset. And again, it's the Home Depot on Wheeler Road, that the employees were very upset. It wasn't treated as fairly, and their pay wasn't great, and in some kind of way that they, they cut their hours, and all this kind of what was going on. So we decided to support him, and so we picked up a sign, not having no part in what he was talking about. I mean, not as far as material gain, but we said we was going to support him, and so we then had these communications with him. I believe his name was James. We would communicate with him, and every time he had a demonstration, for the most part, we would do our best to try to make it stand in support and hold a sign. Keep in mind, at that particular time, there wasn't a whole lot of protests and demonstrations and things of this nature that happened outside of some things that may have happened locally. There's some demonstrations may have happened locally in the 80s and early 90s with prominent individuals and leaders here in the city. But outside of certain individuals, I never saw a protest. I never saw a demonstration. I didn't see a mass demonstration until much later, probably 10 years later. Well, yeah, probably 10 years later with Trayvon Martin in 2012, 13, etc. We didn't see any mass level type of protest. So this whole concern or idea about a protest was pretty much a new thing. It was a very much so a new thing in terms of us more or less having the opportunity to participate, and folks passing by looking at us as though they seen a deer with wings or something, and something special, as though they never seen that before. And so, I totally get it. It was 2002, 3, early 2000s, and for the most part, for most people, if they told you, they would very much tell you that life was very good at that time. And so what are we protesting about? But we have to understand that the treatment of workers, if the treatment of workers is something that's very essential, and at some point in time, we all have the experience of being workers. We all have the experience of having to exchange our ability to work for goods and services and income, things of this nature. And so that's what most people have to come in contact with at least some point in their life, and unless they are part of the 1% community for the most part, financial community that it is. But anyhow, this is my interaction with Erick Khafre. This is how I ran across him initially. This is how we began to work together. We didn't. It was by mere chance that we actually had a class together with Ms. Brown, computer literacy at David Carter High School. It was by mere chance that we interacted again or ran across each other again on Wheatland Road. And it was not by mere chance again that we both together went to these churches and institutions and tried to get some support to figure out if they can direct us on what we should do. And of course, I think the best thing that we did run across was Bandeli Tayumba, again with the Pan-African Connection, who accepted us with open arms without any type of discrimination as far as who we were, as far as our politics or our perspectives or our experiences and our individual beliefs. Whereas again, with the church, was immediately turned off just because Eric expressed to him that he wasn't a Christian. And so it was immediately shut down. And so we realized there, and maybe this is not the case for all spiritual traditions, maybe it's not the case with everybody, but usually what happens is you have to be a member of those types of groups in order to get support from those types of groups. Usually that's the case, or at least that's been my experience. Maybe you have had a different experience, but that was my experience. But this is my interaction with Erick Khafre. We're going to discuss it a little more, but I just kind of wanted to give some details as to how I met him and how we ultimately became the people that we are today, and we are still interacting today. Peace.